Hello, everyone. My name is Lex Zard. I am Technology and Human Rights Fellow at Carl Ryan Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University. And I'm super happy today that I'm moderating this panel called The EU's Next Move on Online Advertising. So, panel is organized by AWO, an agency that provides strategic advice, research, and legal services in the field of digital rights. And as some of you may already know, AWO is currently conducting a study for the European Commission about regulating online advertising. And I'm also one of the external consultants working on the study, and the study is going to be at the center for some of the themes that we're going to be discussing today. So we have seen last couple of years and months, we have seen some initiatives that have affected the industry. Apple ATT, Google Privacy Sandbox, emergence of contextual advertising solutions, notorious consent or pay model, but also the increase in enforcement of the GDPR, as well as the implementation of the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. And so today we're going to talk about what are some of the most pressing and remaining challenges in the online advertising ecosystem, and what are possible strategies to resolve them. So agenda for today is that I'm going to ask 2 rounds of questions for the panelists, and the first round will be about what are the challenges, and then the second round will be more about the strategies to deal with these challenges. And later we do something different, a bit different. So last 25 minutes, if I will moderate properly, then we will have 25 minutes to turn to you guys, and instead of regular Q&A, maybe collect some of your thoughts about the main concerns, as well as some of the solutions that you think. And of course, the panel will respond and merit your suggestions and comments. Of course, questions are welcome as well. So now, the panelists, I am very happy that today we are joined by Denis Sparas, the Deputy Head of the Digital Markets Unit at DG Connect, which oversees the enforcement of the DMA. Also, Harriet Kingabi, who is co-chair of Conscious Advertising Network. This is the organization, this is a non-profit organization with 190 members ranging from advertisers, media agencies, and civil society groups who focus on redefining advertising so that innovation, impact, and integrity go hand in hand. That's how it. So the next one is Natalia Bielova, who is the Research Director at National Institute for Research in Digital Science and Technology, also known as INRIA. She's one of the most well-known academics in the field of privacy and online advertising. Last but not least, Nick Button will speak on the panel, who is the Senior Policy Associate at the AWO, who is organizing the panel, but also the lead researcher on the study that is the center of today's discussion. All right, so let's get started and start from Nick. Nick, can you please tell us a bit about the study and maybe some of the preliminary insights that we already have?
Cool. Thank you, Lex, and thanks everyone for joining us for this panel. So I'm going to start off by kind of tying many topics that you've heard likely during this conference together. So as Lex mentioned, we're doing this second study on online advertising, and we did a first one which was published in January 2023. And so what we found regarding the main issues in the online advertising market that time around, we found basically broadly 2 broad sets of issues. You have the societal issues on the one hand, so the privacy problems, which you're all familiar with. We have the problems related to ads, funding harmful and illegal content. We have the fact that sensitive personal data is being used to exploit users, and then you have a mountain of other issues. So the societal problems on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you have the economic issues. You have problems like market concentration, the classic duopoly. You have the lack of transparency for advertisers, for publishers, a kind of like dissatisfaction with the way that the market works. And at the same time, you have publishers in general kind of struggling to compete with large platforms when it comes to competing for ad spend. And tying all these things together is a kind of political economy problem. And that's the fact that when a market establishes itself, it will impose the conditions under which alone it can exist. So what I mean by that is that the market kind of like establishes these rules that allow it to perpetuate itself, to prevent disruption to its revenue streams. So what I'm talking about is a kind of like these kinds of rules, this kind of justice that act as a justification to minimize other concerns, like the societal concerns that I mentioned before. So it means that whenever you're trying to tackle these societal issues, you're essentially, you run the risk of exacerbating the economic issues. So when you hear things like, what about publisher revenues? What about free internet services? What about competition? That is basically what's happening. It's because the market's functioning and its main problems basically have the same source, and that's personal data. It's both a resource in the market and basically the thing that underlies all of these negative externalities, all of these societal problems. So if you think about tracking, right, it's about, it allows ads to reach the right people, it allows advertisers to understand the return on investment. It can help publishers generate more revenues, especially in a market that's habituated, to the use of personal data. It's just the fact that like bids that have cookies or trackers associated with them can just fetch more revenues. And yeah, but at the same time, the use of personal data in online advertising creates these privacy and security issues. It creates these exploitation risks, and essentially it helps bad actors know more about their users, which can help them essentially fetch higher bids or generate more revenues. So in all that, I want to talk a little bit about data initiatives, like the Privacy Sandbox, like the ATT framework, because this highlights these issues, these initiatives kind of like highlight this dichotomy perfectly, this kind of like problem perfectly. So again, the Privacy Sandbox, for those who are less familiar, it started off, the idea was phasing out third-party cookies, then it was about a global consent prompt, and now we'll see what, not clear where it's going. But it started off, with the idea of phasing out third-party cookies. Then we have the Apple ATT framework, which is this prompt that you get when you first start using an iOS app that asks you, do you want to be tracked? And you can say yes or no. So neither of these initiatives is perfect. I won't go into too much detail there. But if you look at the status quo with tracking and third-party cookies, you can see it's kind of like a net improvement, right, on the situation that we still kind of have right now, and therefore kind of net improvement when it comes to the externalities, when it comes to the societal problems, because you're essentially reducing the use and sharing of personal data. But at the same time, Google's own testing shows that if you turn off the tap, if you turn off third-party cookies, and you turn on the APIs, so like topics and protected audiences, publishers still stand to lose around 20% of revenues on average. When it comes to the Apple ATT, there's research that suggests that it could have led to a shift in ad spend away from advertising on iOS apps, so third-party apps, third-party publishers, into ads on Apple's own ecosystem, so within the Apple App Store. At the same time, you're familiar with the scrutiny that the Privacy Sandbox has received in the UK. You've got the cases in France and Germany with regards to Apple. And this kind of suggests that when gatekeepers implement data initiatives, there's a risk that they'll take decisions that benefit themselves at the expense of the rest of the market. And so these kinds of trade-offs between the economic issues and the societal issues exist basically in like every approach to reforming the online advertising market. So basically, if you look at alternative models, it's the same thing. It's the exact same thing. If you're looking at contextual advertising, you're curbing the use of personal data, and as a result, you're reducing the negative externalities, the societal problems. But it's less measurable, and publishers that adopt just strictly contextual advertising often fetch lower bids, so that means like they generate less revenue, right? So it works for certain publishers, it doesn't for others. On the flip side, if you look at consent or pay, it's the same thing, just the other way around. So publishers that adopt consent or pay can expect to generate higher revenues because they have access to more data, but at the same time, they're enabling more third-party data sharing, more use of data, which can exacerbate the negative externalities. And so in conclusion, I want to say that basically every approach to fixing the online advertising market comes with these kinds of trade-offs. And the competition cases in Europe suggest that these trade-offs could be more negative when data initiatives are implemented in ways that are unfair. So it highlights the need for a kind of balanced approach, and also highlights that like in every single sector, when you're trying to make things more sustainable, there is a risk that there will be some disruption.
All right, thank you, Nick. So, as Nick said, there are a lot of trade-offs that will be in any case in online advertising ecosystem. Harriet, can you please tell us a bit about the main issues that your organization is concerned about?
Yes, absolutely. So just for a bit of context, for anyone that doesn't know about the Conscious Advertising Network, we're a not-for-profit, but we have a large and diverse membership group, and that membership includes people like advertisers and media agencies, but it also includes civil society groups. And what we try and do is we try and act as translators. So for many civil society, civil society groups are experts in fundamental rights issues. They're experts in sustainability issues, and they bring them to us. And many of us have worked in kind of the civil society sector and the advertising sector. And what we look at is making sure that the advertising sector also understands these issues and is able to act on them. And in the same way, we bring across insights from the advertising sector into civil society. And we do that because actually there is a lot of crossover in terms of what we are collectively worried about. Everything that Nick has just described creates systems that do not work for advertisers as well as not working for us as civil society groups and as citizens. And it's really important to understand this. So I'll give you an example. The current system of incentivization of the production and distribution of hateful and legal content actually causes falling trust in the information that we see online. It causes polarization and social unrest. On a very commercial angle, this is bad for advertisers because when you've got advertising in less trusted environments, it's less effective. You sell less stuff, frankly. And it's bad for us, obviously, because with that polarization comes social unrest. And social unrest depresses GDP, which is, again, bad for business. If you take it on an issue like climate change, for example, if you look at the monetization and distribution of climate disinformation, which is aided and abetted by some pretty nefarious groups, or how about commercial entities that create chocolate or coffee or champagne, or all of those products which are actually incredibly reliant on us sorting out that problem. So what we find is there's a lot of alignment within these, with these organizations. And what we look at is finding areas of alignment, and we look at how we action them. Now, one of the biggest issues that we see within the system is that there is a total lack of transparency. Now, I don't have to tell you this, you know all about this. But advertisers cannot find out, generally, where their advertising is going, what it is appearing next to, and therefore what they are inadvertently funding. Through things like creator revenue shares, they're unsure where their advertising is appearing next to, kind of hate preachers online, and this is a big problem. It's not just a big problem for what the United Nations calls information integrity, which is essentially the quality of the information that is in our ecosystems. But it's also a problem for advertisers because it damages their brand, right? So excuse me, I know I'm framing this in very business terms, but this is the kind of translation work that we do. And to be honest with you, they're as fed up with this system as we are. It's rendering their advertising less effective, it's causing problems, as I said, all of these things. So we are strangely aligned in this, and I think transparency in these kind of advertising supply chains would allow advertisers to manage them more differently. Now, if I think about, for example, a very famous sustainability case, Marks and Spencer's. Marks and Spencer's mapped their supply chains. So they knew where cotton t-shirts, the cotton for cotton t-shirts was picked and farmed, where it was processed. They were able to identify child labor, child slavery and other labor issues in their supply chains, sort them out, reduce waste, and make things more sustainable. Now, the same options are not available to advertisers within their supply chains. They have these vast digital supply chains. They're pouring vast amounts of money into what is essentially black boxes. And they're not necessarily seeing the return on the other side. And in the same way that these things can damage, these things damage society, they damage brands. And so, for us, it's the opacity that's a large part of the problem. If advertisers could tell where their advertising was going, then it allows them to make different decisions. It allows them to think about, for example, increasing information integrity, investing in things like journalism, investing in things like content for the LGBTQ+ community, which is massively disenfranchised by this current system. It allows them to think about, well, am I investing in climate journalism, safe climate content, making that available to people? It allows them to think about all of these things. But they cannot at the moment because they do not have the data, and it is very difficult to get that data. Now, we're seeing that change after an organization called Check My Ads released a report into the monetization of child sexual abuse material online by advertisers. There has been a movement towards transparency. So certain vendors, Amazon and Double Verify being two, are offering advertisers URL-level data about where their advertising is going. But that is not industry-wide. We do not yet have provisions for that kind of granular data under legislation, and it's continuing to cause problems. So for me, and certainly for the UN, who through their work on information integrity are also calling for this, we see the opacity of the system as a big problem and something to be solved.
Thank you so much, Harriet. So as we see, there's a huge problem of opacity from the advertiser's perspective. Nick also mentioned the personal data as a major resource for the entire ecosystem. So Natalia, please tell us, what are the remaining privacy and data protection issues in online, if any, in the online advertising ecosystem?
Thanks, Lex. It's a pleasure to be here. So I think, well, the first problem in online advertising is still related to the big shift in the ecosystem. So with the phasing out of third-party cookies that Nick was talking about, we actually see the online tracking market change their practices and start adopting new type of tracking technologies. So in my own research group, we observed already an increased usage of multiple third-party tracking solutions that kind of amplify and empower each other. So the first one is, you probably heard, cookie synchronization, and it's a technique that now is used to help companies switch from third-party tracking to first-party tracking, which is very hard to detect and to analyze. Second, we also saw cookie resurrection. Basically, it happens when the users delete their cookies. They probably don't want to be tracked, but the cookies reappear. And this works thanks to browser fingerprinting. Now, so these tracking technologies that you probably heard about still are there, and they are still amplifying each other and helping the market to adapt to the situation. Now, there are also other forms of tracking that comes from industry proposals like Unified ID 2.0, which is basically based on user emails and phone numbers instead of cookies, which is actually would work really well because it's rare that we are changing email addresses and phone numbers, right? So it's very stable. It's very hard to delete this type of identifiers. And finally, we also see an increase of server-side tracking. So these are techniques that are placed basically directly on the server, and it's impossible to see them because we don't see cookies, we don't see any code in the browser, so it's very hard to audit, and yet it's actually a big trend right now in the tracking ecosystem. So my first point, to summarize, that the evolution is actually happening. It's happening extremely fast, and today we need new tools to audit this type of system. So my second point that I want to make is still about user consent. So at CPDP, we heard a lot about cookie banners. And you may think that it's a kind of an old topic, but actually there are still many problems about it. So the first is about the consent interface, and the second is what happens behind the interface. So there are multiple works that looked into dark patterns and how they manipulate users into accepting. I conducted myself a research together with the CNIL, where we found out that it's actually extremely easy to manipulate users. When they see 2 times a cookie banner without a reject button, on a third banner, they already changed their habit, and it's much more likely that they will click accept. So again, there are many studies on this. I don't want to talk more about it, just to raise this point. But what was overlooked so far is what happens behind the interface of the cookie banners. And here I want to show some visuals. So let's imagine that we are visiting a website, and we see, well, we think that this website will be sending some requests to, of course, the domain, the server of the website. So in my hypothetical example, it's example.com. But what happens when the web page loads is that you have multiple JavaScript libraries that are loaded on the fly, and they are dynamically loading other kind of libraries. Some of them will participate in the programmatic advertising ecosystem that will then share this data and share cookies or other data further down the chain to identify who is the winner and who will show the ad on the page that the user is visiting. Okay, well, now if we think about consent, when I'm interacting with the cookie banner, I'm expecting that my consent is recorded correctly, which I represent here with this green checkbox, okay? So what happens behind the interface? Well, we expect that this consent is going to be shared with all those various parties that will be informed about the user acceptance. Now, in our recent work, we decided to look at consent withdrawal. It's a right within the GDPR. Okay, so we will go to the websites and we withdraw or revoke our consent. And in theory, our expectation is that everyone will be informed. Well, in reality, this doesn't happen. There are still many third parties that receive the acceptance and they do not receive the revocation of consent. So it's actually a very big problem, but not really looked into so far. So we have a new paper that just came out about this. We found on 200 websites that basically half of them have non-compliant interfaces. 10% of websites do not even update the consent record when you withdraw. And most importantly, 74% of websites fail to communicate consent correctly to all those parties. So the consequences of this is that the third parties keep on using the data, they keep on storing the consent record, and they don't even know that the user has withdrawn. Yeah, so I think that this is a big problem that we still need to address in this ecosystem.
All right, thank you so much, Natalia. Dennis, please, we're very curious to hear main concerns that you see from your perspective, how you see it. Maybe you can talk to us about that.
My fear, and first of all, many thanks for the invitation, but my fear at the moment is, listening to all 3 speakers before me, that, my intervention will be quite repetitive, right? Because, probably if you look at, the main challenges which have been identified quite some time ago, if I think about the inception of the 2 regulatory acts, which, we are mainly interested, so which is the Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act. I mean, when I say we are mainly interested, of course there are other, in the regulatory framework, there is of course the GDPR, there is e-privacy framework. So we have a set of rules, which are dealing with the various issues that we are identifying in this ecosystem, right? But if I think about, in particular, DSA and DMA and where they are coming in the inception stage, right, is, one is dealing with the societal problems, which is the DSA, and I think Nick, put it very nicely. The DMA is more, looking at the economic side of things, right? Again, even that economic side of things will always have societal impacts, So what is driving, monetization, amplification of content, so it's a question of economics, but it's also, very quickly you will have a societal impact, right? But there is a common point to all this, which is the transparency, right? So that the question of the main challenge, which is, and if you look at the inception work that has been done at the stage of the DSA and DMA in 2019 and 2020, I mean, what came very clearly out of both, in a way, is the transparency. The question is just, transparency for whom? And you essentially, what you realize is that is the transparency for the whole, let's say, value chain, starting from the advertiser and coming to the end user, right? Then the question is just which tool are you, in a way, using or can use. So if I start from the advertisers, and on the other side, of course, you will have publishers, right? I mean, I think you use this notion of opaqueness, the black box, things like that, right? So this is a challenge, right? Advertisers don't know what they are, do not necessarily know what they are paying, how much they are paying, they cannot really assess, certain aspects of the service which they are procuring, and where normally, when you are buying a service on the market, you would want to know what you pay for, right? And, if you have more players in that chain, how much you pay for each of them and for what, right? On the other side, publishers also want to understand, what share of the overall pie they're actually receiving, right? And where are the different shares of that pie staying and for what purpose? So this is one thing that we see as a challenge, and of course, the result of that challenge, which has been identified, is the DMA. And again, I think you were saying before when we were discussing a little bit, you learn about the provisions, right? I mean, if I think about advertising transparency in the context of the DMA, you have this provision in Article 5.9, which is about the advertising, advertiser side transparency, 5.9, which is about the publisher side transparency, and then also about, performance type of metrics, right? So that people actually don't just know what they are paying for and what they are receiving, but also that they know, how their ads are performing, And what is even more important in that context is, not only, how it is performing, but that they can actually audit, check that for themselves, Because again, one of the things that you will hear from many of advertisers in particular is exactly what has been already said, we don't know what is actually happening, where our content is being shown, let alone then, being, of course, being worried about, the brand image, I would hope, it's a good in me that every advertiser, even though, of course, you want to amplify and get as much as possible for the, investment that you're making, that you're also behaving socially responsible, right? So you don't want your content to be associated with something which is, let's say, illegal, harmful in any way, right? So that's maybe the economic side. But then, I already entered the societal side, which is, end users being exposed to different type of advertising, not knowing why, not knowing how to, get out of it, because they don't want to be exposed to certain things. And then we get, I actually was not aware of the study, but it's actually quite interesting conclusions, right? That it seems that giving consent is relatively easy, but then withdrawing consent is slightly more, complex exercise. And, again, this is also something which has been recognized, in several pieces of legislation, including in the DMA, where, we have this obligation saying like, as easy as you accept something, you should be also able to withdraw. But just to maybe touch a little bit on the societal side of things, I mean, of course, you have DSA, you have transparency provisions. Those are very much related to what end users understand what is happening in this ecosystem. And what is, I think, also very important when you're really talking about society responsible behavior is the question of advertising, to minors, where you have very specific, obligation that there is no advertising based on profiling to minors and things like that. And these are very, very important objectives because these are challenges which you see, right? I mean, amplification of certain content, especially when it's associated with advertising that you kind of trust, right, can lead to very, very negative outcomes. And I don't have to cite any study because there are many of them out there which are kind of pointing to this problem. So, I mean, again, I'm sure there are more challenges, but when I think about and when we think about this, and you will also have seen some of our work which we have done, including, for example, on ad repositories under the DSA, it always boils down to this question of transparency and what you can achieve, right? I mean, again, I'm not saying this is the only challenge and only objective, but it is a very, very important one that drives. Maybe it's just a first step, but I think it's a key first step, to be able to deal with other issues that may exist in this. And I don't want to be too long because, I'm also interested in the discussion.
All right, wonderful. So we talked about the concerns. So we mentioned personal data and privacy issues, what Natalia mentioned, but also opacity issues and the role of transparency in the whole supply chain is one of the central concerns. So let's now move on to maybe some possible strategies to deal with these issues. Nick, maybe tell us a bit about the gaps that you see, that we see.
So the short version is that there are quite a lot of gaps. So I'm going to focus on just one issue that overlaps with several other issues, and that has to do with the targeting prohibitions that Dennis has just mentioned. So we have the language is you're prohibited from targeting based on special category data, based on profiling, and you're prohibited from targeting to minors based on profiling. These prohibitions apply to online platforms and online platforms only. So it means that it basically doesn't apply at all to the open web. So if you're out there on a regular publisher, you still have the chance that you'll be targeted based on special category data, and as a child, you may still be targeted again based on profiling. The second kind of gap is that I described specifically the language because both of these provisions are limited to targeting based on profiling. And that's an important distinction because the market is changing. The market is changing in that advertisers aren't really targeting in the same way that they used to anymore. They're not saying, I want to target ads to men who are over 30, who are dual nationals, Belgian and Italian, wearing boots. They're not doing that. They're just saying like, this is my ad for some nice boots. Who will be, and they just kind of let the algorithm decide whether, like, who they should target the ads to. So does that involve profiling? I think the question is, it's an open question, and I think a lot of the time it doesn't. So again, here, this is something that would happen on online platforms, such as Google, such as YouTube, et cetera. And if you're talking about exploitative forms of targeting, right, there are many laws that cover this issue. So we're talking about the GDPR, the DSA, the UCPD, and essentially we're seeing that AI could potentially be used to kind of circumvent all of these kinds of restrictions on targeting. So on that front, we thankfully have this new law, the AI Act, right, which does kind of deal with this problem, right? There's like prohibited practices which include the kind of manipulative and exploitative uses of AI. And these kinds of provisions, if you're thinking about, an advertiser that would, I'm a gambling company, I'm a casino, and I want to target my ads at gambling addicts. The use of AI to kind of like find gambling addicts and things like that. It's clear. I mean, it's like made for that. But I won't go into too much detail. But the language of the AI Act is such that it doesn't really seem like it applies to online advertising. And on top of that, there's a notion of, the practices have to cause significant harm, right, to be prohibited. And that's a pretty high bar, which is kind of hard to, reach. Beyond that, so we have the definition of an online platform in the DSA, right? And we have these honestly these great provisions, Article 34, 35, on risk assessments and mitigation. So if you're a very large online platform, you have to, not just assess the risks, the existence of systemic risks on your platform, but you have to mitigate those risks, including when it comes to your online advertising systems. So you can criticize what a VLOP might put in place, but at least there's a legal requirement to do something, something to build upon. If you're not an online platform, you don't have to do any of that. So if you're a DSP, if you're an SSP, if you're a regular ad tech intermediary, no matter how large, you're not legally required to assess the existence of systemic risks, to assess the potential that your services can be increasing systemic risks. So if we're thinking about exploitative forms of targeting that harms children, that harms vulnerable people, those are systemic risks. Ad tech companies don't have to do anything about that. If you're a DSP specifically, you don't have to do anything to kind of monitor the existence, the idea that illegal ads could be funneled through your services. So malvertising, scam ads. If you're an SSP, so working with publishers, you don't have to do anything to make sure that disseminators of disinformation, aren't using your services to monetize, through ads. So I'll stop there, but I think these are kind of like the two of the biggest, kind of most obvious gaps that we're seeing.
Harry, actually, wanted to ask you first, maybe briefly, tell us the impact of the DSA and DMA, and also tell us, look ahead a bit, and how do we fix some of the issues that we raised.
Thank you. Well, I think basically a lot of the response to the DSA and the DMA come down to understanding what to do with the information. Right. So what we see when we talk to advertisers, and we do a lot of that, is that the system, the amount of stuff that they're dealing with is so complex that often, I think often there is a lack of understanding of what to do and there's a feeling of powerlessness, frankly, because an individual advertiser, we've had advertisers who spend millions, if not billions of pounds, go in to talk to vendors and partners and say, hey, we're not very happy about this. And their vendors, they get fobbed off, frankly. And so it comes down to this opacity again and this kind of power imbalance that you've got. So more data is great, but we need to kind of facilitate actually what we do with that data. And I think things like the transparency obligations within the DMA are hugely welcome. But like I said, I think what we would love to see is that addition to thinking about helping advertisers understand their supply chains, because I think that feels like something that fits with what advertisers already know how to do, which is to look after their corporate reputations, look after their supply chains, make sure that they're not committing harms within them, that they've got those skills. And what we often see is that there's, because, we've talked, Nick, I'm in awe of your knowledge of the ad tech system. Full disclosure, I used to be an ad tech journalist and I still don't understand it. So, it's fantastic. But you've got people sitting in major advertisers spending loads of money with these organizations and they don't understand it either. Right, so we've got to, this is why we need industry initiatives and we need initiatives to sit alongside policy that are looking at changing culture. So we've just released something called our guiding principles, where we've gone and asked a load of advertisers, how we can better help them. And one of the things that came back was we need to be asking more questions. Sounds really trite when we're dealing with these kind of huge issues, but we do. As an industry, we need to be asking, particularly with AI products coming to us, being used by organizations very quickly, is organizations need to understand the harms. So Policy is really helpful, but we need that translation job. We need to help the people who are spending the money, who are working with ad tech providers, all of these technology companies, to understand what to do with it. So that's one thing. And then I think, in terms of fixing the problems, gosh, there's so many of them. But I think there has been an attempt recently to try and politicize what are essentially business decisions around where advertising goes. That has come from places with non-European values, and we as the business community has made bets based on legislation that's coming through. They've reorganized things. They've made significant changes internally. But the business community needs to know that those regulations are going to be enforced, that they're going to be protected from some of this. So I think that's a big part of it as well. So from the policy side, as I said, transparency. At URL level, we need education kind of campaigns to help the community understand. And I know many of you sitting here in organisations that are fighting for funding are going, we're not going to be helping large corporations to do that, and I would totally respect that. But there is that problem. And then I think that we also need to, I think we need to kind of understand the power of industry initiatives to sit alongside, not just industry initiatives, cross civil society and industry initiatives, to actually play some of those roles and act as translators and kind of get more cohesion between the two groups. I don't think that fixed the problem, but I think it get us a long way there.
Yeah, we're going to go in the good direction. All right. Natalia, we heard about some of the opacity issues and the solutions for increasing transparency. Please tell us a bit more from the privacy data protection side of things.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think there are short-term and long-term goals here. So for the short-term goal, I think when we come back to the issue of consent, then we still have many problems around regulating consent interfaces. So again, I have just very few visuals here. We had a recent paper where we analyzed regulatory guidelines providing best practices and compliant practices when implementing consent. And we compared them to the results from research user studies, trying to measure how the various design elements actually impact the decision-making of the users. So we made the comparison of these two worlds that exist in parallel. And when we did that exercise, we found a lot of mismatches. So regulators themselves don't agree with each other necessarily on what is compliant consent. Okay, that's already a first problem. But the second problem is that the user studies that actually show what users care about are not necessarily taken into account. So I will just show you one example of such a mismatch, which is actually a transparency example. So the guidelines require that there are multiple disclosures of multiple types of information for the users, but the user studies continue showing that it makes no effect on the decisions of the users, neither in the form in which they are shown nor in the content of that. So in our paper, we found 11 different gaps between the user studies and the regulatory requirements, and also insights for researchers. For those of you who are doing research here, it's important to take into account the guidelines as well when you are designing your study. We found some cases where researchers were studying something that was not relevant for the regulators. So that was my first point on which I wanted to have some visuals. So it's really important that regulators consider this type of studies, and not only in the context of cookie banners, but in context of any privacy controls, any kind of systems where users make decisions that correspond to their rights. So my next point is more long-term goal. And here I want to talk about standardization, because I think it's really key to try to solve this problem. So we can analyze what happened to the do not track. So it was a yes or no signal to notify everyone if I want to be tracked or not. And we know that today do not track is not supported by the regulators. So what's important, however, to understand is that there are two kinds of standards or proposals. There are signals for consent, and there are signals for refusal. And I still think that we have not carefully considered the signals for refusal within the European space. So imagine that users who don't want to consent could have an opportunity to do so and exercise their right to withdraw consent and also to the right to object to processing as per Article 21. And that could be also an indication of user wishes not to be bothered at all with these consent requests, and everyone knows about the consent fatigue, right? So actually such proposal does exist. So there is a proposal of global privacy control. Some of you may have heard about it. It's currently supported by the California Consumer Privacy Act as one of the possible expression of opt-out of sale. And such signal can be expressed directly in the user's device and can be sent to all the websites to inform them of the user's preference to opt out. What's interesting, however, is that it doesn't solve all the problems. It's just the first level because it will indicate the refusal, withdrawal, or objection only to the website itself, but not necessarily to all the third parties, so the problem that I have shown you before. So currently, we have actually a global non-compliance for the withdrawal of consent. We have 74% of the websites that we have found where not all third parties are informed of withdrawal, and it is a big problem. And today, it's actually a Wild West. Companies can store consent where they want, in any format they want, communicate it in the way they want. So it's extremely difficult to build tools that will audit this because we don't have any standard here. So I think to try to solve this problem, we need to have an auditable standard for storage and for communication of consent. And we also need a very strong requirement to protect the consent integrity. Because as of right now, this consent is actually not secured, and anybody who touches upon it can actually change it. So from a security point of view, it makes no sense. And finally, I want to also point out that the research community in web privacy measurement is very active in this topic. So the study I showed is only one of the kind. And that currently we're preparing a comprehensive survey describing all the new tracking technologies that will be put online next week.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to that. Well, public loves you. Dennis, so Wild West, how do you deal with the Wild West? And what is your experience with the implementation of the DMA so far?
I think many people are actually using Wild West for internet, and maybe it's true, maybe it's not, right? But I think what we are all trying to do is to kind of put some order to it, right? So when it comes to the DMA, so I will try to be a bit more structured and systematic again. So when it comes to the DMA, I mean, what we have seen, at least, in terms of the compliance solutions which have been put forward after the entry into application of the DMA is, certain solutions which should lead to, increased level of transparency, So, for example, one of the complaints before, which we have heard very often, is data is very often provided at a very aggregated level. It's very difficult to understand. We don't have access to, input data or raw data, things like that. I mean, we see many, solutions by the gatekeepers, of course, the relevant gatekeepers in this case, who are putting in place these more, granular type of transparency measures where advertisers and publishers, can get certain level of information that they may have not received before. Is the world perfect today? No, far from it, So, I mean, I think, again, we are probably in the stages. I mean, what we see, yes, there are certain measures which have been put in place, but we also see, a bit the question, do people actually understand what they are getting fully, right? So there is indeed a need to have a close cooperation, right? Are, people actually receiving all the data which they would want, so that they can take certain informed decisions, because this is something which the DMAs, for example, after also probably not in all circumstances and in all cases. And then you will always, have, situations where maybe, certain compliance measures are not exactly what you had in mind, and where this is like a living, process where improvements come as you get the feedback from the stakeholders, right? And here, I think one of the big asks, and, people maybe even in this room who have talked to us about, the feedback to the compliance solutions, right? I mean, we are very much seeking that, right? Because for us to understand what is really effectively working and delivering, we need to understand what is needed and what is maybe not understood. I mean, coming back to your point, right? It's not only about getting things, but also understanding things and how things work, right? And, it's even more the case for the performance measurement, right? There, because this is something which I really think it's very close to the hearts of many advertisers, right? I mean, there is a lot of potential there, but we still see that even though, there have been solutions which have been implemented, right? I mean, there is still a way to go to really achieve, what I think we wanted to achieve, that, there is like as full information, for the advertisers as possible to know what they are paying for and, how the specific advertising campaigns are actually, performing. And again, important part of that is also their own ability to audit that, right? So based on the data which they receive from the gatekeepers. Now, on the side of the DSA, I mean, of course, we saw the possibilities coming out of ad repositories, right? I mean, there is a lot of information which is being published. Of course, there is a huge amount of information, which can be interesting for researchers quite a bit, right? But again, it's also a question of, understanding those, that data, organizing that data and actually starting a research. And we actually, again, in the context of the DSA, the role of civil society, the role of a non-governmental organization, the researchers is very, very important one, because coming back to the point that Nick was making, when you think about the risk assessment, when you think about, mitigating measures of the, very large online platforms or very large online search engines, there is assessment which is done by the providers themselves, but you also want to have a critical look into that. Of course, we as regulators, we are doing that, but any input that can inform that assessment is very, very useful. And we already see a lot of input, based on the advertising data, based on, many other things which we are receiving from the risk assessments, right? So again, things are moving. I think they are moving in the right direction, but I think challenges that we have talked about here, I think we all share. So the question is, how most effectively to bring all this forward. So, I mean, studies, the one that Nick and, I mean, you guys are undertaking studies and reports we heard about. I think this is very important part of that discussion, but let's not fool ourselves, it's a process, we will not have a perfect solution tomorrow. It's important that all the, let's say, players in this ecosystem, talk to each other, understand each other, try to see what the objectives are. And, something which I always say when it comes to the DMA and DSA, I know that, people very often, read, Commission open non-compliance investigations, Commission imposed the fine. From our perspective, that's not what we are after. We are after, effective compliance solutions, right? So we want to have, what advertisers and publishers need, and we want to have that dialogue between advertisers, publishers, and providers of the service, to deliver what they actually need, right? And not to go after the gatekeepers or VLOPs for breach of these laws, right?
All right, wonderful. 23 minutes left, so we're good with time. I see a lot of hands. Whoa. All right, I saw her first over there.
Thank you, Kasia Szymilewicz, Panopticon Foundation. To the landscape of changing laws and looking more promising that Denis just described, I would like to add a recent decision of Belgium Appeal Court in the case a few of us ran against AIB Europe for 7 years until from day one of GDPR being enforced. So after 7 years, we have heard that TCF framework that is responsible for all the consent spam that you have just complained about, and we hate it same way, is illegal. So I'm wondering how that decision might shape the market. Is it opportunity or not? And specifically to Harriet, I would be interested to hear whether there are any initiatives between publishers and advertisers to cut the intermediaries, because from a layperson perspective, that would be the most obvious way to go. So what's happening here? Thank you.
All right. wants to take it.
Yeah, so I can try to provide some elements of response for that. So, in the IAB decision, the TC string, so it's a record of consent that is attached to the IP address, right, is recognized as personal data. So now, what we observed in the current web ecosystem is that this consent record is no longer so actively present exactly in the same format and exactly in the same place. I don't know the reason for it, but I'm seeing that the consent record is no longer as easy to detect as it used to be. And I don't know how the decision will actually affect that, or it was already a divergent kind of practice in the ecosystem that changed. So I think that's the first element I can provide to that.
Maybe Harriet, or you wanted to add something?
No, go ahead.
Okay, I'll try and I'll take a little bit of the consent question, but obviously just a little bit from an industry perspective, is that for all the researchers in the room, if you can prove that this consent spam is reducing trust in the content that people are consuming and therefore reducing trust in advertising from a consumer perspective, then I would really recommend that you tell the advertising press, because there is an obsession within the industry about increasing consumer trust in advertising, which is in free fall, partially because our information ecosystems are full of rubbish, consent spam included, I assume. And I think there is a conversation that's worth disrupting if you're in that field of work. Number one, and then number two, yes, there are initiatives where publishers have either got together in groups. So there is things like, and I've forgotten the name in the UK. There are a few where publishers have generally banded together and advocated for things like direct buys, where you're not doing all this kind of spraying your adverts across the internet, frankly. But we've got a number of issues with this. I think the first of which is, advertisers are being offered ever more complex and harder to understand products are being developed that suggest that actually they'll get better bang for their buck. Lots of the advertising kind of function of organisations is hugely expensive, and guess what? We're in recessions, and so there is a kind of pressure to cut costs. And the metrics by which the success of advertising is measured often at board level even, but certainly within marketing functions, are based on metrics which have been put together by the ad tech industry to try and prove how successful it is. So whilst this seems like a rational thing to do, from a business perspective, right, advertising that's in news is more effective. Like, people remember it more, they trust it more. It sounds like a good idea, but it's more expensive than buying some of these complex products. So there's all these kind of market dynamics that are at play that actually get in the way of what seems like common sense. And I guess what we're trying to do is work with brands who are making those more, who are circumventing some of these cheap products, and who are taking a more, taking more oversight of their advertising supply chains. Because what's happening is, frankly, their sales are going up. Like, they're doing the thing that they say they want to do through the advertising, and they're investing a bit more, but you've got to have someone within those organizations who can get buy-in for doing that, because the marketing functions are so used to using metrics of success that have been put together by ad tech companies. So it's a complex thing, and publishers are trying to fight that, but we need those case studies from organizations to change that industry conversation as well.
Nick, did you want to?
Just a super quick point on the IAB decision. I think there's some disagreement about it, right? And I'll say it's fairly recent. I haven't read it myself, but you have on the one side people like Panopticon and the ICCL who say the decision means the TCF is illegal, RTB is illegal. Then on the other side, you've got IAB Europe, and the platforms and so on and so forth who say, well, no, the decision doesn't say that. That's not what the decision's about. It doesn't say that. It also, part of it concerns an old version of the TCF. So I think that if there's a point on whether certain practices are illegal as a result of the decision or not, I think there needs to be a little bit more communication on the implications, because the decision itself is quite technical. And if you look at the advertising press, I think everyone is kind of wondering what it means, and I'm also wondering what it means, and I look forward to reading it when I get to it. But I think there's a point to be made about communicating the implications more. Yeah.
All right. So I do want to ask, like, because we are like dying to hear from you as well, like what you think, we can do, and what are other concerns, and of course ask questions as well if you have. So, all right, let's go. Who wants to chime in? Okay, this lady over here was the first that I saw.
Hello, thank you for this excellent panel. My name is Alice Schwartz. I work for the Utah AI Policy Office. One thing that we're concerned with on the horizon for advertising is that large language models, specifically chatbot products like ChatGPT and so on, are now a main source of information for many people. ChatGPT is getting more traffic than Wikipedia these days. And Sam Altman, Jeff Bezos, and the like have hinted at that the very near future for these bots is that there's going to be targeted advertisements in these chatbot interfaces, possibly even having the chatbot recommend products to you or even make purchases for you. So I wonder if this is the future that we're heading towards. Are things like the DMA and DSA the providing the right framework to address advertising in that space? What are the problems that you anticipate here? Thank you.
Boom. What a question. Who wants to take it? You?
So there's good news. There's good news, and there's so-so news. So you can read a very good paper by my colleague Laureline Lemoine and Matthias Vermeulen on this topic. But the DSA itself, right, regulates very large online platforms, very large online search engines. And the question of whether an AI chatbot would be included within that framework is essentially whether it qualifies as a search engine. So if you can use ChatGPT to search the web, right, and there's a sufficient amount of users, it would count as a very large online search engine. And therefore, one day, if ChatGPT decides to start showing ads, it will, OpenAI would have, again, to, assess the risks linked to this advertising system and mitigate those risks, just like a normal, very large online platform. The bad news is that that's basically it. Like, if it's not directly searching information from the web, it doesn't count as a very large online search engine, and it's unlikely to count as a very large online platform because it's not facilitating the exchange of information between different users. So I think to that extent, I think we're not covered. I think there's probably more risks associated with the ones that would be search engines, because that is where users would be searching for information and therefore could be misled, including through the use of advertising. But again, it has to meet the threshold of a very large online search engine for it to kind of like fit within the risk assessment, risk mitigation framework.
I don't think I have much to add to this, but I very much agree with Nick, right? I mean, before jumping to a conclusion, the framework which we have in place, is, maybe not the appropriate one or misses something. I think we really need to go through, the whole analysis to understand very much what is happening, to understand the product, to see how the market is developing, and then, to what extent the tools we actually already have. And it's not only about the DSA, it may also be about the DMA, because, as quickly as, something may be identified as an online search engine, there may also be a question, would that online search engine be, if it's an online search engine, it is a core platform service, would also be a gatekeeping service, and then all the consequences, including, ban on self-preferencing, things like that. But again, I think it's important not to, jump to conclusions and, necessarily start thinking already about, new tools, but rather, really understand and work with what we already have. And again, maybe there may be some gaps, and we would need to think about those gaps. But I think we are not there yet, I think.
Over there.
Hi, thank you very much for the really insightful panel. My name is Ronit Wilmersdorfer, I'm with Volt. And I guess I have multiple questions, but if I only get one, I'll ask Dennis about what we learned from Natalia right now about the gaps of implementation and enforcement from third-party advertisers in retracting consent. Is that something that the Commission is aware of and that they're trying to address right now, or is that something that you're taking away from this panel as something that will move up the priority list? Or maybe you can talk a little bit about if there's anything that's being done about that. Thank you.
I mean, so, when you said Commission, of course, and, it's not that I want to dodge your question, right? But I mean, you will appreciate that, the tools I'm responsible or, that I work on are the DMA and DSA. And of course, there are certain aspects of consent, like a specific consent in the context of, obligation on the gatekeepers to, give users, the possibility to give such a specific consent where they are combining data across, different services across their platform. But to this specific issue, on the ease of the withdrawal of a consent, as I already said, DMA has a specific obligation on the gatekeepers, which is more about, when you enter a contract and how you can exit the contract. But to me, at least, this sounds more as a question of, informed consent and possibility to withdraw consent in the context of the GDPR. And, probably, things that I don't know because I'm not on a daily basis working on the GDPR. Colleagues in, Just who are working on it are probably very well aware of this, right? And just maybe as a last point, and it doesn't really go to your question, but it goes to one of the points which was made before. We have many rules, and there are sometimes these questions about the interplay between the rules, right? And this was also one of the reasons, as you probably know, because it's in the public, because there are several provisions in the DMA, for example, where there is a question of interplay between the GDPR and the DMA. We are currently, as a Commission, working with the EDPB on joint guidelines to provide to the market, guidance how, when you have this interplay, how that interplay works out, right? But to your specific question, I would expect that my colleagues are very well aware of that, and Natalia may even know that, but that's not something which we are directly working on.
I think I want to complement this. If we find some issues like this, like with withdrawal of consent on the websites of gatekeepers, then what happens? I mean, in case you already have some answer to that.
Well, I think, I think it's very important if you identify these type of issues to be brought to the attention of the regulators, right? And it doesn't matter where you go in the Commission because, essentially we are one big, institution and we will talk to each other. So, we as, regulators of the gatekeepers, let's put it this way, we would want to know of this type of market development, even though, maybe we would not be directly responsible for the enforcement of the rules which are behind. So, we are the right addressee. I'm sure colleagues in DG Just are the right addressee. But, when the problem is identified, I think the most important thing is, let's bring it to, someone's attention and let's give the necessary, attention to it.
Lady over there.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Zeki Soysal. I represent Tilburg University Law and Technology faculty. My question is, currently with AI coming, with the mining of big data, we are in the hyper-personalized ads era, where instead of target groups, we have target individuals. And people are experiencing things like, for example, a user losing their cat out of a snake bite. They write to their friends via like a WhatsApp, and within like a week, they see all the their X contents about snakes versus cats kind of thing, and just to like increase the chance of interaction, which lacks the humanity of it, but for their engagement. And this is going to be like there are speculations that with AI, customers representatives showing up with mesh faces of loved ones like mothers or fathers or the ex hair and voice to sell more products or again increase the engagement. My question is based on human rights or DSA or DFA, what will be the future limitations for these kind of manipulative actions for online advertisement? Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Anyone feels compelled? Yeah.
I can give an industry answer. Because it just goes back to trust. Like, if you can, like, people are already creeped out by online ads. People already think their phones are listening to them. They already, if you go on Reddit, there's absolute, loads of information of people just going, I don't like this. And I imagine that, there's two things here. The first of which is that, the production of AI-generated content in order to get advertising money, it's essentially kind of a form of advertising fraud, is rife. There's a corporate organization called NewsGuard, which is looking at the number of AI sites, and it's going up exponentially. So we're already kind of there is already that AI-generated content in order to kind of suck people in, to keep them scrolling, seeing more ads, etc. And that's already a big problem. And
5 minutes left.
I'll be quick. And so actually, this is where better curation of advertisers' supply chains is an idea, because then they won't appear next to it. Again, if all the researchers in the room, if you can prove that this kind of advertising, with your loved ones' faces appearing on it, that's weirdly tailored to people, is making people go ugh, and making them distrust the brand and not buy the product, and you can get that's the stuff that they will listen to outside of legislation. So there's like the storytelling piece in a corporate kind of way, which is we're going to lose money if we do this, and then getting that into the advertising press so that they hear it and see it. It's something that I would, that you're all sitting on wealth of information about what a problem this is. But it's about getting it in front of the people that need to hear it, which is the people that are buying this technology, buying and using these technologies, because they think it's a shiny thing. They think it's cool. I go to Cannes, and every year everyone's talking about is AI, and and people think it's cool, and they want to use it, and they want to be creative, and they want to do it. They're not thinking about how harmful is it. So I think all of us can tell those stories and tell the industry what the harms are, and put it in terms that they'll understand, which is that they're going to lose money.
Yeah, just some data, like advertising passed $1 trillion last year, and 70% is digital rights, so around 700. So advertisers are spending more than 700 billion a year. So it's good to communicate to them some of the practices that can go wrong. Felix.
Hi, Felix Mikolash from Neub. I have two quick questions. First question for Harriet. I didn't know the conscious advertising network, and I was wondering how it's financed, who pays more, who pays less. And the second question for the Commission. As I understood in your first intervention, you were focusing a lot on transparency. And given what Natalia said, or the IAB judgment that was mentioned, shouldn't we try to actually fix the system instead of trying to be more transparent about it? Thank you.
Cool. Yep, I was expecting this question. We are completely funded by philanthropy. I take no money from ad tech. I take no money from companies. We are completely independently funded, and we made that decision because we want to fix these problems, and we want to give equal weight to the voices of civil society, and get that into the advertising space. So I'm not here to make excuses for anybody. What I tell you because I know that it gets this industry listening, and I'm framing it deliberately in that way because storytelling really works, and storytelling really works in this space.
And I will be probably even shorter, because for me, it's not about transparency versus fixing. I think, transparency is part of the fixing, solution. So for me, that's, as I think I mentioned, I hope, it's kind of like one of the, first steps that you need in order to be able to understand everything, have that discussion and to be able to fix if you identify that there are issues to fix, right? So I don't see it as, one versus other. I see it as two complements, right?
Last question. Olena, over here. Yeah. I didn't take that into consideration.
Hello. I would be a bit nervous because I'm afraid of public speaking, but still. Thank you for the impressive panel. EdTech is listening to you carefully. And my question would be very specific in case you know the answer. Is there a tendency to change the OpenRTB protocol itself, because it is the one allowing to collect enormous amount of identifiers, of geolocation data and stuff?
Thank you. So if there is an idea as a strategy to actually modify the bit stream of the OpenRTB.
In terms of like what we're considering as a, well, I think that like what we're thinking about is less necessarily about the protocols specifically, right? I mean, it's very difficult for policy to say, you should be using this technology, you should be using this software, this industry standard instead of another, you should modify this industry standard. I think it's quite complicated to do that, right? Should there be like should the EU come up with like its own standard that the online advertising industry should rely to do auctions and things like that? I think that's complicated. I think that what we can say, and this is also kind of highlighted by the concerns of the Belgian decisions against IRB Europe. It's that when you engage in RTB, right, and this is also what Natalia was saying, your information goes out there, right, and your ability to secure that information is basically very difficult as a user and as a publisher. No matter like if you're trying to, even if you work with a small amount of third parties, right? You're working with just a few SSPs and so on and so forth. Once users' personal data has entered the bitstream, has entered the ecosystem, your ability to ensure the security of this information is very, very difficult. So from that point of view, I think that the thing that needs to change is that. So getting to a point where we can say data can enter the ecosystem, and we don't have to worry about the privacy problems. We don't have to worry that people are being tracked and that's being used to, monetize, problematic websites and things like that. The specific solution is difficult. Right now, it looks like the solution is, if data is going to enter the ecosystem, it should be anonymized, right? Because that's the only way you can have real security. Is that necessarily the solution? That's a solution, right? Yeah, so I think that's more the kind of things that we're focusing on.
All right, please help me appreciate the panel. Thank you very much, everyone.